introduce Ruth Benn. Ruth is the co-author of War Tax Resistance, a guide to withholding your support from the military, published by the War Resisters League. She was on the War Resisters League staff from 1987 to 2000 and served as coordinator of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee from 2003 to 2018. She works part-time for a nonprofit in Brooklyn and is active with the New York City War Resisters League. And now I want to add a few additional thoughts that are not on the script. I spoke with Ruth the other day, and it occurs to me that now more than ever, with so much happening in this country, it is a moment where we all must be brave in the face of threats of retribution, intimidation, and attempts to suppress the fight back to everything wrong happening in this country and being perpetrated on the world. And really, I think there's hardly anybody who so exemplifies bravery in the face of repression than Ruth. So give a warm welcome now to Ruth Benn.
Thank you, Carl and Vandra, for inviting me, and everyone for being here, and also online. And I should say that movie clip is from a film, Stranger Than Fiction, which came out, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago or something like that. But we use that one quite a bit just because it kind of sets the stage for things. So I do have some slides. They're about 12 that we'll work our way through. So we'll see what, I'm not going to read everything on the slide because I think everybody here and online can read it. If you can't, let me know. But this quote from John Woolman is from 1755. So, we talk about this April 15th dilemma, or the tax dilemma, especially now, as Carl said, with everything that's going on in the world. But of course, probably since the very first tax for war was levied, people have been refusing. There's been somebody out there who said, I am not going to pay for war. So in this case, John Woolman was speaking to the Society of Friends, the Quakers in Philadelphia, and struggling over how the society was being asked to pay a large tax for the French and Indian War. And that tax was the first time the Quakers had resisted a lot of just war taxes. But in this case, it was a mixed tax, like ours now, where some of it goes to the Pentagon and some of it goes to the good things that we like. So he was struggling over that, and that's what his quote is about, of doing this thing contrary to my conscience appeared yet more dreadful. So that was a long time ago, and the next slide, we're going to jump up to more current era. Eras, I guess. We kind of track the current war tax resistance movement, if we can call it a movement, from World War II. And it was at that time that pacifists who'd also refused the war and the withholding for income tax was instituted during World War II, so that everyone or more people were responsible for taxes at that point. And especially the pacifists and World War II resistors and people, Quakers, Mennonite brethren, members of the peace churches, began to look at the taxes and think about how to deal with that. So World War II, and I put in these waves of war tax resistance. There have probably been a few others over the years, but these have been the main ones. In the 60s, of course, the Vietnam War, and that's the era that I kind of came of age. So the Vietnam era stands out, and also another period where there were so many resistors to the war who also, when they refused to fight, said, I don't want to pay someone else to fight. So that was a big era. The 1980s with nuclear weapons and Reagan, who raised the military budget. And in 2003, the invasion of Iraq with the huge protests around the world, and many people joined in war tax resistance at that time. So it kind of goes in waves with some of the wars. 2016, of course, with the election of Trump, and then he was talking about not releasing his taxes. So that brought a lot of attention to taxes again and people being angry about taxes. And now we're in this era with Gaza and the genocide in Gaza, with U.S. weapons sales and the U.S. support for what happened in Gaza. Many, many young people have come searching for what to do about their taxes. And of course, now, with Trump in office again and ICE, many reasons why people are looking at tax resistance again. And of course, Venezuela, that military action, bombing people in the Caribbean, bombing the boats, and now Iran. So those are some of the waves anyway, and they tend to rise and fall with wars and with the peace movement. When the peace movement is strong, more people find tax resistance. So the next slide, go back to the World War II era, and these 5 people we talk about as the founders of the modern war tax resistance movement. They're all gone now, but they were with us for many decades, and many of us knew these people, and they were really wonderful influences. Wally and Juanita Nelson on the left, Ernest and Marion Bromley in the middle, and Maurice McCracken. And they were all part of Peacemakers, a direct action, nonviolent direct action organization that was founded in the late 40s. And Peacemakers, they were part of a subgroup also that was specifically about war tax resistance. And you can find a lot about Peacemakers online, actually, and all of these people, wiki pages for them all. But they started putting out press releases around tax day and asking people to sign on who were refusing taxes. So in 1959, they had 70 non-payers who signed on to their press release, and I'll just read a little bit of that. But Maurice McCracken on the right, who was a pacifist minister from Ohio, he signed this, they all signed the statement, but at the time he was spending 6 months in prison for his refusal to pay federal income tax. And he said at the time that he went to prison, if nations will not lay down their arms unilaterally, then individuals must. The time to act is now, he said. So their statement that they sent, they released as a press release with these 70 signers, says, war making has come to be the major activity of the federal government. Nowhere is the fact better reflected than in the federal budget. The staggering tax load placed on the American people is staggering only because of military expenditures, which at that time took 4/5 of each tax dollar. The sharp upward trend of expenditures for high-powered bombs and long-range missiles greatly increases the possibility that mankind will be extinguished. We dissent, and we want our lives to be a counter-friction to stop the machine. As individuals, we assert with Henry David Thoreau, what I have to do is to see that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Some of us have refused to pay the whole of our taxes. Some of us have refused to pay part of them. Some are living on incomes intentionally kept too low to be taxable. Some have given non-cooperation to the collection of taxes for war by filing no tax return. So that was the statement they sent out that year, and they tended to get pretty good publicity at that time about their tax refusal in those early years. The next one has a few other people and kind of random highlights from these decades of tax resistance. So in the 60s, the Vietnam War, and one of the biggest campaigns at that time was the phone tax, which some people here may have participated in. The tax was raised to this excise tax, federal excise tax on the telephone, to 10%, and they said at the time it was for the Vietnam War and just for the Vietnam War. So it became this very specific tax that was fairly easy to resist on your phone bill, and 200 to 500,000 people participated in that. We've never had a good way of tracking how many war tax resistors there are. But at that time, that was a pretty big range, but it was pretty accurate. There has been a legislative effort over many decades to have an option for conscientious objection to paying for the war taxes and the violent parts of the budget. And it was first introduced as a World Peace Tax Fund bill into Congress in 1972. And Ron Dellums was the key sponsor, a representative from California for years. And that piece of legislation is still in existence. It hasn't been introduced in a while, although the current representative sponsoring it is Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, and he threatens to introduce it again. It's now called the Religious Freedom Peace Tax Fund Bill. And then these other times with Hunthausen out in Washington during the 80s and nuclear weapons, when there was a focus on that. In 1989, a home was seized in western Massachusetts. Randy Keeler had been a Vietnam-era resistor who spent a couple years in prison for his resistance to the war. And he became a war tax resistor, and that's not very many houses have been seized in our network. That's one of the last ones in 1989. The IRS has that power to seize property, but there was a big campaign around that, and there's actually a film called An Act of Conscience that's made from that action. It went on for 4 years, so maybe sometime that would be something interesting to show. And should mention National War Tax Resistance, founded in 1982. War Resisters League was one of the organizations that helped found that network. And it's really been the sort of pacifists, anarchists, and others, who are not just war tax resistors during one war, but see this in our budget for so many decades. And it really has helped to keep that organization alive, which has been lucky because it's the one organization that's really called on now by thousands of people, actually, who are looking to figure out how to resist their taxes. And then a few other things here. Julia Butterfly Hill, people might remember her from when she sat in the redwood tree to protect the redwood forests in California. And in 2003, she made one of the largest single amounts of resistance of $150,000 that she got from a legal fee. And she's managed to pretty much to stay out of the IRS's grabbing hands in all that time, and she's still very active on many issues. And Cindy Sheehan, whose son was killed in the Iraq War, when that happened with the invasion, she was against the war and refused to pay her taxes after that. She was one of the last people in our network who's been taken to court for her tax refusal, a case that was eventually dismissed, and she never did have to pay the IRS anything. And the last one, Rachel Cohen, she has an Instagram feed now that it's a few minutes long, and she does talk about war tax resistance. It's not just war, ICE, many reasons why she's choosing to resist. And she announced it a couple weeks ago, and she's refusing $8,800, which is a good chunk of money. And that Instagram and many of the other posts on social media have just exploded the interest in tax resistance now. It's pretty huge, and social media has just made really a tremendous difference in outreach for war tax resistance. It's quite amazing. So the next slide. Quote there about how it steals twice, these taxes, from paying for war and also not paying for the things that we want. And so there are many reasons why people come to war tax resistance. Most of them have been active in other things before they come to this form of resistance. I don't know how many people just wake up and say, I'm against war, I'm not going to pay my taxes. I think it takes a little more than that, maybe. But many people resist, like I do, because of the budget priorities, because of this huge amount. Really, this year we've calculated about 58% of each tax dollar going to the military. So it's just such a huge amount of money that is being wasted, really, on building weapons and killing and enriching these few military contracting companies. So many people do it as a protest of a particular war, or they get started because of a particular war and stay with it. Some resist as part of a nonviolent lifestyle, really looking to pull themselves out of the system as much as possible. And others, a simple witness against violence and war. So the next slide is, this is we have for people who are here in the room, there are pie charts on the table which you can take. It's a flyer that War Resisters League puts out every year, and we analyze the budget. It's been a little tricky in the last couple of years because this administration didn't really release a budget that we could analyze last year. And this year, it just came out on Friday. So some of you might have seen that news that Trump just released the budget with this huge 1.5 trillion for war. An increase of 600 billion this year, just a huge increase, certainly the biggest ever that he's asking for the military and for the Pentagon. And we know that he and many people in the Republican administration now really kind of see anything else that our tax dollars are doing as not something we should pay for. They're really, he's talking about cutting 73 billion from the other services and giving 10 billion more to ICE and Border Patrol. So there are big changes with this budget. He didn't really get everything he asked for last year, so we can kind of hope that this doesn't really come to pass. But Congress has been very slow about dealing with the budget. The new fiscal year starts October 1st. So from now until October 1st, they're supposed to talk about this budget proposal and then vote before October 1st. But usually the budget hasn't been getting passed for months after October 1st, which is why they keep having all these shutdowns and issues with the budget. So we'll see what happens. But obviously one of the things to do is to call Congress people and demand that they don't pass a budget that has this huge military increase in it. So the next slide is more about how to resist. And I'll just talk about it from what I do. But as you heard, even in the quote from the Peacemakers press release, people do it in different ways. And it has to do with maybe the reasons that you get into it, the goals, what your living situation is, all kinds of things. The most common methods to resist are to refuse some or all of your taxes. Obviously, that is resistance, or finding a way to live on a less than taxable income. And in New York City, that's kind of hard for a lot of people, although there are many people in our network around the country who do it. Some live in community that makes it easier to live on a low income. For myself, I was living in Massachusetts in the late 70s, and I got involved with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker organization. So I learned about war tax resistance through them. You know, the materials were in the office. And I also lived in an area where there were a lot of war tax resistors. Wally and Juanita Nelson from the World War II era lived in that area, and there was a lot of action, a lot of activity around them with war tax resistance. So I had a lot of people around me that kind of were spreading this word. And I was working for AFSC in 79 when the President Carter introduced draft registration. So we were doing a lot of hanging out at the post office, encouraging young men to think twice before they register. And I realized that one thing that I could do, because I wasn't subject to draft registration, was to refuse some of my taxes. So I think at that time, I'm sure I wasn't making very much money, but the phone tax campaign was still going on. So I probably got started at a low level with a phone tax campaign. And I just was struck, there's a slogan that National War Tax Resistance uses: if you work for peace, stop paying for war. And that just made sense to me. And honestly, at that time, I thought everybody in the peace movement was a resistor. Little did I know, it was a pretty small segment. But it got me involved, and you kind of tend to start out pretty small as you try to figure out what you're doing. And I had always filed. I'd already been a filer, so I have always filed. I've always been open with the IRS. Every year I send my tax forms in, and I send a letter saying why they're not getting the money. I've always owed something. I made sure that I would owe something at the end of the year. I don't think I ever much got a refund from the federal government. So my letter always said, what I was doing and why, and even if it was a small amount. And then in 1988, I actually went on a human rights trip to the West Bank and Gaza. And when we were in Gaza, we met a lawyer there who looked at all of us Americans and said, "Watch your taxes." And at that point, I came home and I said, okay, I have to resist everything now. So I shifted from a lower level of resistance to refusing 100% of federal income taxes. And I've never made a huge amount of money, but every year it's been, say, $2,000 to $4,000 that I've refused. So that's kind of what got me going. And I was working for War Resisters League at the time, so I also had many people around me and was in a very supportive network. It really does help to have people around you who have been resisting for years and tell you what to do, the next thing that comes along. So I've been lucky in that way, and I encourage people, if they're resisting or going to start resisting, to get involved with the network here or wherever you are. So the next slide gets into all those scary risks and consequences. And for myself, well, we all get letters, many, many letters. So every year, if you file by April 15th, maybe by late in the summer, a letter comes saying, did you forget something? A very polite letter from the IRS. And the third letter gets, the letter, they have a series, and usually it's 3 that get more demanding. And the last letter they send says intent to levy when you have an open debt. And at the point they tell you that they have this intent to levy, then they can do some of these other things, like bank account levy, salary levy. Of course, the interest and penalties are adding up along the way. So if I owe something, I had to look it up recently, and I owe something like $26,000 now. So a lot of that is interest and penalties. So there is that factor. The penalty caps at 25%, but the interest keeps adding up. And if you're in the federal system or the Obamacare, the health insurance subsidies do rely on tax returns or tax filing, because the IRS manages that. So there are some ways that the government has really been trying to draw everyone into the system. And health insurance is certainly one of them. Student loans, which federal student loans are also have a relationship. Yeah, they look at your tax forms. And there are ways, we have in our network ideas for dealing with things like that. It can affect credit, which in my life hasn't made any difference, but I have heard in the last number of years that for young people, especially like landlords, have started looking at credit and things like that, which didn't happen to me. But I have learned, that that's been a factor for some people with the credit rating. And if you want to buy property, although we do have a lot of people in our network who've managed to buy property with questionable credit. And employers for a while were looking at credit, although in New York State they're not supposed to do that. So for some people, that may have more effect than others. But you have to work up a pretty good debt before that happens. And the loss of passport right now is any debt over, IRS debt over $64,000. And that also increases a little bit year to year. And I did add a note there about it being hazardous for non-citizens, certainly now because of ICE, and there is some relationship with IRS and ICE these days. I mean, Congress was trying to stop, some of Congress trying to stop the IRS from sharing information with ICE, but apparently it's been happening a bit. For myself, I actually have been pretty lucky over the years. I mean, I feel like I never did this to get away from it, to get away with it, you know. I really resisted openly and assumed there would be consequences. I've had, years ago, $800 taken from a bank account, I think. And now and then, like I think during the Bush years, he gave some tax credit, and that kind of never came to me. That gets taken. And Social Security, which I'm on now, is certainly vulnerable, although the IRS has been pretty inactive since the pandemic. Since 2010, they've lost a lot of staff because Congress, particularly the sort of Tea Party people who came into Congress after the big Tea Party actions, they don't like the IRS, and so the IRS lost a lot of funding over the last decade or so, and then DOGE and the Musk people came in and whacked off a bunch more staff. So the IRS has been cut a lot, which does make it easier to resist. But, you know, as I say, I never did it to get away with it. So you want to get the government's attention. You know, we do get their attention to some extent just by having them send us letters and keep after us. I did have one visit with the IRS in 2009. An agent who was with, it was called the Abusive Tax Avoidance Transactions. I was working for National War Tax Resistance at the time, and that particular branch of the IRS was going after organizations that maybe encouraged war tax resistance, but particularly organizations that offered some kind of scam. And there are a lot of the more libertarian, right-wing type people who tend to fall for these scams about how income tax never passed Congress, it's not legal, you don't have to pay, all kinds of things. And so I think when he did look at my personal debt, which at that time was $40,000, and he looked at the organization, and I had one voluntary visit with him and one, and at the end of that, when he knew I wasn't going to pay, he handed me a summons, which he already had filled out, which was for a second visit. And that one I had to go out to his office on Long Island and answer questions on like a 4-page, huge, long legal sheet of all these questions. They're really looking for your assets. And a number of us in the network have discovered, certainly before I met with the IRS, that using the Fifth Amendment was a way to respond to this. So I used the Fifth Amendment on all those questions, and they never followed up. They let it go at that time. So otherwise, you know, there's been like one person we know of in the last couple of years who's had money taken from a bank account, and very few people jailed. Since World War II, it's been about 30 to maybe 3 dozen at most who've gone to jail related to war tax resistance. Often it's contempt of court. It's something else that's not. There are only a couple who've actually gone to jail for refusing to pay. So that sort of thing is very rare. The IRS really wants the money. They're not going to get it from you if you're in jail. So, yeah, and property seizures are pretty much nothing these days. They don't have enough staff to carry out such things. So, but in terms of all these risks, you know, really, if you're thinking of starting to resist and starting small, just one step at a time, and not thinking of the worst case scenario, which is one of our people said that's paralyzing. But taking small steps and getting into it, and I've found it to be an incredibly empowering action over the years. You know, there's such fear of the IRS. So when you find that you can like do this and survive, even, having to meet with the IRS or knowing that anything could happen anytime. I mean, they could come take us all to jail tomorrow, who knows? They do have the power. But it is very empowering to take that action, especially against this feared agency. So the next slide is a little bit more like that on the benefits of matching your money to your values, kind of like the song, dignity and humanity, governing yourself, being accountable. So, and I mentioned there, supporting other things by redirecting the money, which is what I do. When I refuse whatever amount it is, I make sure that I give that money away to organizations that do good things and don't kill people. Some of them local, sometimes victims of war, some of the veterans peace organizations. I kind of have a list of groups that I give to. So in that case, if the IRS does come and take money from me, I've ended up sort of paying twice in that sense. So there are people who set the money aside just in case that they have it seized. But anyway, otherwise, being a cog in the system, heightened awareness of personal finances. I do find for me that it also has made me less of a consumer, I think, of really, you think about money a lot. You think about, what will happen if, and just, there was a point where I owed $20,000, some decades ago. And that point I kind of went, okay, I guess I'm in this for the future. And I kind of knew I'd probably never own a house when property seizure was more threatening at that time. Or I knew if I had a job and the IRS came to seize the money, I would probably quit. So, I've over the years, you kind of realize, step by step, okay, this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm doing. But it has been a perfectly good life anyway, thus far. So non-filers do like to stay out of the system, stay private, just not be involved. Lots of anarchists in the network who just don't want to deal with the government and figure out a way to run their lives to live their life where they can pretty much be out of the system. Okay, and the next slide is just on slightly different topic. Particularly Vondra had mentioned, other related issues of what your money is doing. And I just made this slide of some of the campaigns that are about investments, both personal investments for your employment, your retirement funds from your employer, institutions like colleges, college investment, the city actually, where are they investing the money for the city retirement funds and things like that. So these campaigns, Code Pink has one called Divest from the War Machine. And on their page, they have a lot about also institutions and other, not just personal finances, but contacting Congress, your city, your university, and other places. And they connect to that other one called Weapons Free Funds. And that's the name of the website, Weapons Free Funds. And you can go there and put in any fund, and it'll tell you where the money's being invested or if it's being invested in weapons. And they also have sections about the environment and all kinds of other things that people would be concerned about where their money is going. The one under that, Don't Bank on the Bomb, is particularly about nuclear weapons, and that one's out of the Netherlands. That's an international campaign. And the last one, I think, is a little bit more about shopping. I didn't read that whole site very well, but Resist and Unsubscribe is one that Vondra had found. And I know they were looking at Amazon and some of the other companies about, trying to keep your money from whatever they're doing, whatever they're working with. Just more awareness of consuming and where the money is going. And then I think the last couple of slides are really just other mention of resources. Next one. Yep, the book. And there are a few copies here. We did bring some copies. They're $20. But it has everything in it. Profiles of resistors, some of the stories of like the first 5 people who were our founders, amazing stories from a lot of longtime resistors, and all the how-tos and questions, philosophical questions, and information about the network and all of that. And the last slide is just the organizations. National War Tax Resistance is based in Milwaukee now. It's really a very small organization. The budget's never been, I mean, I think this year it's like $70,000, but it's doing, it's just does great work and keeps really good resources on war tax resistance. And people who don't come just because of war, ICE has really inspired a lot of people. Whatever reason you're refusing taxes, it's pretty much the same process. So the information from the organization has been incredibly useful. And of course, War Resisters League was founded in 1923, been around more than 100 years now, and was one of the organizations that was an early supporter of war tax resistors. The Global Campaign on Military Spending is out of Europe, and they have terrific information just about military spending internationally, which is also going up in so many countries, as we've seen, and just loading the world with weapons. So they have action days, April 10th to May 6th, and we are always out on tax day, and there are flyers for that on the table. And the National Tax Strike is a newer group that has some good information for people just getting started or who aren't really ready to resist, but might want to just kind of be a cog. I mean, they're encouraging people to do things like call an IRS office and say you want to pay in person, and this like totally disrupts the IRS. They don't usually get this, so just kind of some ideas like that they encourage. And I'll just mention, I don't know how many people saw that the New York Times did a big spread on on tax rebellion, and war tax resistance was part of that story. It's actually a pretty good article. It was in Tuesday's paper, but it's also online. And The Guardian had a couple really good stories. There's a lot of media attention this year, which we don't usually get. So that's been pretty exciting, that just to inspire more interest. And since we're thinking ethically too, this book was mentioned in the New York Times. It's a woman named Ruth Bronstein. She's out of Princeton, I think. And she has this book, My Tax Dollars, called The Morality of Taxpaying in America, where she's kind of looking at the history and other groups who've also gotten into tax resistance. So it's an interesting book anyway. She's a sociologist, so she's looking at it from that point of view. So I think I've just filled up my time.
Thank you. Thank you.